All right. Welcome back to the Mature Male Podcast. I'm your host, Wes, a psychotherapist helping men mature through timeless wisdom and practical guidance. Today's guest is Dr. John Williams, a licensed clinical psychologist and couples therapist who has dedicated his career to understanding relationship dynamics. John works in the corporate world as a psychological test developer, has been married for 20 years, and is trained in 4 major empirically supported couple therapy modalities. His unique perspective combines clinical expertise with real world experience in navigating the complexities of modern relationships. John, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Wes.
Yeah, excited to chat. So, something that you've observed that you've gotten comments on that men have had negative experiences in couples therapy, whether it's feeling like the therapist was biased against them or that they got unfairly treated in the process. How often you see the feminine expression being prioritized in therapy settings, things like emotional expression and intelligence, softer communication styles, and attunement. And what impact do you think this has on a man's willingness to engage in therapy?
Let me say first that, this is something since I started the Cheaper Than Divorce Substack, where I talk about couples therapy principles. I've gotten comments on some posts from men who had negative experiences in couples therapy. And the more I talked to them, the more I understood that, they felt just what you said, that there was kind of an implicit bias against them for being men, and that because the vast majority of therapists are women. So I'm listening to this going, wow, I'm a guy, like I do this work, but I didn't really think about this being a factor. So for me, it's sort of still an open question. I mean, it makes sense from two perspectives. One perspective is, yeah, I mean, we all have inherent biases toward all kinds of demographic groups, right? So it wouldn't be strange for therapists to have those same biases as everyone else. On the other hand, it could also be a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. I mean, I know that there is a substantial number of men who kind of go into a couples therapy situation a little bit against their will and are kind of resistant to it. And that's sort of where my experience is, working with couples where I can tell, or, when I do the individual interview with a male partner in a hetero couple, he says explicitly, like, I don't really understand this. I don't know if I believe in this. I want to be here because my wife wants to be here, but they already feel a little bit maybe on their back foot. So, my job in the interview is to really try to learn as much as I can about this person, both people, especially also to let the guy know that, like, I'm here for both of them, and I'm going to try to be fair and represent both sides of the couple equation. It's when you're a couples therapist, the client is the couple. So you're really working on behalf of the couple. And so sometimes you kind of lean on one person a little bit, sometimes you lean on another person a little bit. And if I have a man who I know is a little bit hesitant, I'm going to be a little bit more, not exactly on his side, but I'm going to really want to make sure that his needs, like his thoughts, his view of the relationship really gets a full airing and is validated. So that's sort of my opening statement on this.
Yeah, that makes sense, especially because in these cases, it seems like the woman doesn't need convincing, is already open, and to some degree is already trusting if she's reaching out, wanting to help, and looking to you for that help. And I'm sure it's a fine line, of course, because you don't want to over cater to the man. It's important he realizes it's his responsibility to show up and be open amidst bias or unbiased. He still has that role to play. But I share the same experience with clients as well. And I'm curious what your take is on why the woman tends to initiate it. Is it more like a self-awareness thing or more of an openness to change? Or why do women primarily initiate that couples therapy?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can only speak from my experience, and my experiences with a certain demographic of kind of highly educated, sort of coastal elites, for lack of a better term, people who are pretty well off, have good jobs, and who are already kind of sort of bought into therapy being a useful thing, just like you might, go to a personal trainer, you might go to a nutritionist, you might get, a golf coach. It's sort of all in that same kind of like sort of wellness space where you're looking for expertise. And so, a lot of times both people are in that space where they're open to it. A lot of men have already had individual therapy for stress, depression, anxiety. So I get a lot of couples where both people are already they already have their own therapist or they've had them. But there is a certain not type of client, but it's because it really crosses all different kinds of people, where I get a strong impression from the female partner, and I would say 80% of the time it's probably the female partner who makes contact with me, that they would really like me to help fix their guy. You know what I mean? Like they have a sort of a list of things that are wrong, and a lot of it kind of point to things that either their partner is doing or who their partner is. So, maybe this kind of ties into the first question you asked as well. So there's a bit of a process I go through to sort of course correct from that initial contact.
Yeah, and on that note, that is the next question I had about women having this right way of conducting a relationship. But before we get there, when a woman typically comes and expresses the desire, whether directly or indirectly, to fix her male partner, where do you think her perspective or expectation comes from? I mean, is it the media? Is it self research? Is it families and traditions? I'm just curious if you have a sense of where that general idea of what an ideal male partner should look like.
A couple things come to mind. It's sort of a cultural stereotype around, women kind of having to whip a man into shape in order to be, a better husband, that kind of thing. Like men don't know how to be in relationships and women kind of have to train them. There's certainly that, but I mean, I think there's something more fundamental to human nature, which is, we tend to view ourselves as kind of the center of our own universe, so to speak. And, it's really easy to look at other people and think, well, they have the problem. I'm not the one with the problem. They have the problem. So I think, there's some of that basic human nature with a bit of cultural baggage laid on top of it. And I'm not saying that all women are like this. I mean, there's plenty of, I would say the majority of women come in saying, like, I'm sure there's stuff I need to change as well. This is kind of a specific case where I just get the strong impression that the couples therapy is going to be about the other person changing. A little cottage industry in the manosphere about, helping men to sort of solve their problems on their own, like solve their relationship problems through kind of personal development. So I think, some men have that. I think, men do come in with a list of complaints. I mean, just like the woman does. And it's not a hetero thing. I mean, any couple will come in with each person having a list of things they wish the other person would change. And, part of the work of couples therapy is starting to identify which things are solvable problems and which things are unsolvable problems, and looking at how to deal with the things that fall into each one of those categories. Because usually couples are stuck in these kind of gridlocked fights where they're having the same conflict over and over again. They're not able to resolve it. And it's no wonder, because usually these are things that have to do with who these two people are as people, right? Rather than simple things that could be compromised away. People don't come to me for easy stuff. They come to me for, we're stuck. Can you help us?
Yeah, I'm wondering, do you find in that solvable, unsolvable, in those two categories, that there are common dynamics or issues that you find show up time and time again, or are they completely subjective based on the couple?
I mean, unsolvable problems, they tend to come out of things that are relatively fixed. Personality, for example. Like a classic one is you have an introvert and an extrovert. And these are not traits that are going to change very much. But if you have a strong extrovert and a strong introvert in a relationship, you're often going to find that they have perpetual problems around their social life, because One person is going to want to be out a lot. The other person is going to want to stay home a lot. One person is always interested in meeting new people. The other person is going to be exhausted meeting new people. And the gridlock there is when people want the other person to change, kind of, oh, if you could only do this, if you could only do that. Where really what has to happen is these people have to essentially accept the person that they're with. I mean, in the Gottman world, we say, when you pick a partner, you pick a set of problems. Pick a different partner, you get a different set of problems. So here's the person you picked, and this is among the problems that you're going to have forever. No one's going to change their personality over the course of a marriage. So the question really becomes, how do we accept who we are and start to adapt to this difference rather than trying to constantly struggle with it? So, I mean, that's one example that I see fairly frequently, but there are others. I mean, like, just think about like, culture. Like if you come from, kind of a hard scrabble background and your partner comes from, a background of great privilege, it's likely that you're going to have some differences about how money is spent, how money is earned, what money means. And, it's really easy for both people to like really be stumped about how could the person I'm with think that way? I just don't get this at all. It's like they're from another planet. So, part of the therapy is like, hey, let's see what planets we're on, and then let's see, where these differences come from. Let's see if we can understand each other, first of all. Can I understand why you look at money this way? Can you understand why I look at money that way? And then once we do that, then we can say, okay, now that we know we really look at this thing very differently, now what can we do? Rather than constantly having the same fight over spending. You know what I mean?
Mm. Yeah, I agree. And I think more and more, because we live in a society that allows you so many options and to give up on things so easily, I find many people just think, well, these problems are too much or they're the problem. I'm gonna get divorced or break up, whatever it is. But to your point, you're just gonna move on and have a new set of problems with someone else. And my experience, my much more limited experience in couples work, I've had a few really sad incidents where it ended with them realizing, or one person deciding that the relationship was over. And I'm curious if you've had any of those situations, and how you may help people navigate if they're in the like proactive and we're working on stuff and it's fixable, and as long as we do the work will be functional, versus some of those things that won't change, that are at a baseline where you just say, man, you just keep butting heads, and this might be at the point where we need to process a different relationship stage.
Yeah, well, I mean, I kind of want to put it this way. I mean, I think most relationships can survive if people want them to survive. I wouldn't say that most people should stay together if they don't want to be together. I mean, yes, you will have a different set of problems with a different person, but they might be a set of problems that you can deal with more easily. Like you really might have a better relationship with someone else. So, I mean, it's hard for me to fault people for breaking up. That said, when I see people, it's because they want the relationship to work. When it comes to these problems, which you know, may or may not be solvable, a lot of times it comes down to what people's core needs are. When we sort of look at how do we compromise, right? When we're trying to compromise on something, we're not trying to meet in the middle. There's not that idea. It's really more about like, what are your core needs? And by core needs, I just mean on this issue, what are your must-haves and what are your non-starters? And the other person has a list of must-have and non-starters. And it's usually a pretty short list. It's usually just one or two or three things. And then, we also have a list of areas where we could be flexible. Like, given what I know about my partner's core needs, what they absolutely have to have and what they absolutely can't have, what are some areas where I could, be more flexible, where I could do a little bit more, a little bit less of this. And they come up with a similar list. What could I do that would meet his core needs without violating my own. That's the thing, because if you compromise away your core needs, it's a failure. It's not going to work. You're not going to be satisfied with that. And what I've found is the vast majority of cases, it's possible to find a way to compromise around the edges just enough to feel like your needs aren't being violated, kind of accepting the rest. You're not going to get exactly what you want here, but you're going to get the things that are most important to you in some way. Now, sometimes this doesn't work. I mean, for example, if what you come down to is one person wants kids and one person doesn't, like, that's just, there is no way to satisfy both people. And if both people's, core needs are going to be violated if they satisfy the other, like, that could be a relationship killer. And I've seen that kill relationships before.
Yeah, that's such a helpful framework. I appreciate you helping people understand, because my sense of it is you can take what you're saying that people do in a relationship and try to apply it as you're dating to try to get a sense of what you'd be entering into, to say, okay, when I'm processing whether or not I should become serious with this person and enter into some form of life partnership, what are the needs that I have? Are they going to be violated, or will I violate someone else's? I think some of those things, and I think it is changing with each generation, becomes more proactive with it. But I still think many people enter into relationships and don't even think about that. And then it's not till they're in it and you hit some major pain point that that stuff tends to come up.
Yeah, I'm noticing more younger, like, young millennials, the older Gen Z folks coming in for like premarital counseling, just like, hey, we want to do the whole checkup thing. And we'll do all the assessment, and we'll look at all the areas, and we'll really try to pull out what those differences are. And often it's not a shock. Because if you've been together for a couple of years, you've had enough. Let's say if you've been more than 2 years, because with 2 years you're still in kind of that limerence phase where everything seems great. But like after 2 years, you're starting to get a sense of like, what are the friction points. And so in a premarital type of situation, we can really look at that and sort of kind of defuse those bombs from going off later. And you can also sometimes, unfortunately, not often, but sometimes identify things that are actually non-starters for one or both of them, where there actually is a decision to be made about whether to move forward or not. And certainly, a broken engagement is better than a divorce.
Yeah, well said. And I have also been surprised by the number of couples seeking premarital. My experience has been it's primarily religious people who find that that's been an essential component before they get married. But I think across the board, it's an extremely helpful, yeah, prerequisite and prelude to the marriage. And I agree. I think even as hard as it is, that engagement time is the point where you really fully decide if the marriage is fully, yeah, what you want to enter into, or that permanent life partnership. So I appreciate you sharing that. And speaking of expressing needs and friction, going back to what you were saying about women having this right way of conducting a relationship, I'm curious how you encourage men to share how they actually feel about situations related to that without fearing they'll be shot down or humiliated, and what role that plays in preventing things like resentment and resistance in relationships.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I sort of want to divide the men into sort of two like overly simplistic categories to start with. And that would be the ones who have um I always use the term emotional granularity, which is kind of, emotional granularity is just a measure of how many emotion words you tend to use, right? How familiar are you with emotional language? Do you have more than one word for anger, that kind of thing? I've worked with clients, and again, this is sort of a stereotype with men, but I've seen it in women too, who have very few emotion words. I worked with one client who essentially had um, hungry, angry, and tired. Those were kind of the three things that he felt. What we know is that emotional granularity is associated with, better mental and physical health outcomes across the board. So if I'm working with a guy who has really low emotional granularity, I'm going to have a different process with him about just trying to essentially do a little training in like how to identify feelings inside the body, inside the mind. We might do a little separate training around that. But, let's assume that I'm with sort of a modern, man has a pretty good emotional vocabulary, but still feels like he's in a bit of a one down position with respect to his wife on this variable, which is that his wife is really controlling, and I don't mean controlling in a sort of intentional way, but that her emotional framework is dominating their conversations. She's probably even more fluent in emotion than he is, and maybe shows some skepticism about things that he may be feeling. So, part of what I'm going to try to do is encourage him to essentially talk about how he really feels, and then really work with the wife to learn how to empathize with that. I mean, that's one thing that I've found that some women are fairly weak on in these relationships. They're really good at empathy when it comes to social stuff and with their girlfriends and family and all this kind of stuff. But when it comes to like, accurately reading and validating their male partner's emotions, not always so good at that. They're often wanting to give a different interpretation of what he's feeling, or say, I don't know that you're actually feeling that. I think you're feeling more like this. And, unfortunately, I think this comes out of some cultural baggage that we have about men being kind of low on emotional granularity, and having sort of a cultural habit of women having to interpret men sometimes. But with men who actually have some emotional fluency, this can come across as kind of like a little bit invalidating. And so what I'm trying to do in those situations is really support that guy's version of reality and the feelings that go along with it, and training the female partner to understand it on a deeper level.
Yeah, I had never really thought about that, but I agree. It is interesting how women tend to assume and have a lot of confidence and say certain things, almost speaking on behalf, like a PR for the man. And I think the man, you're right, in some ways feels undignified and really wants the opportunity to try to get better, to express, but feels that he's kind of cut off at the knees early in that situation. And what a lot of guys might not vulnerably express is it's hurtful, because they're really saying, hey, you don't see me. Now, what you see might not be pretty, but you still don't see me. You don't really get me. And having that humility, I think, on both ends, and patience to say, anytime we're leading with speaking for someone, it usually doesn't end up well. And our ability to kind of sit back and desire to be more curious and understanding instead of just empathetic out of expectation is a way I would put it.
Yeah. And I think what's hard for some women is that, when their partner starts to share how they feel, sometimes they don't like what they're hearing. They don't like the feelings that that person is having. They don't like the worldview or the perspective that comes with it. And unfortunately, um, and this is not women. I mean, we all do this. We sometimes, condemn a person for having the wrong feelings or the wrong thoughts or the wrong point of view. And one thing I've seen is when someone does that in the partnership, the other person can just be like, well, I'm not telling you how I feel anymore, because like I just get this punishment when I do it. And so sometimes we're having to like sort of unwind or unlearn some of that behavior.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. My sense of resentment is it's almost like a unmet and unheard expectation that's expressed through judgment instead of trust. You can kind of have that narrative about someone that you've decided that's who they are, like you're saying, you cast judgment. Well, the reason why he doesn't do this is because he's like this, or he's just like his mom because of this, this, and this, and or vice versa. She always says this because this is who she is, and you think, oh, this is the person I love the most in the world. There's no way I'd do that to someone. But I find it's shockingly pretty normal to have at least some underlying resentment or baseline judgment of who you think that person is. And it sounds like your work is helping them slow down, visit the script they've unintentionally written about someone, and starting to vulnerably and experientially rewrite it together.
Yeah. And the tricky part is that, even though both people in a relationship will tend to have these, sort of error-ridden theories of who the other person is, what they're feeling and why, how they think about things, what their motivations are. especially when we're angry with them about something, we tend to give the least generous interpretation. Even though both partners are doing that, because women are trained to be more fluent in these kinds of conversations, men can often feel outgunned, outmaneuvered, and unable to get their perspective in the room in a way that's validated and respected. So that's also part of what I'm trying to do in a couples therapy session is essentially, support the person, in the way that they need to be supported. And if that's the case with a man, I'm trying to, then I will take on some of that emotion, some of that perspective, and I'll go, not in a aggressive way, but in a gentle way. I will go head to head with the partner on that until I'm able to get her to see how true this really is for him.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that approach. It sounds effective. And something that just came to mind, I do wonder if this plays into it as well, is women also socially bond by being vulnerable and expressing feelings and having that model with other women. A lot of men don't do that in their friendships. And that's if they have friendships with an S. I know statistically, many men aren't having a lot of those close social bonds. So they're not practicing, they're not having it modeled, they're not having a lot of ability to be refined outside of their relationship. And if the relationship has some of those core issues and impasses, as you said, you continue to, they're probably a lot less likely to try, of course, because it's painful and it's causing more issues every time they do enter into that engagement. So I do wonder if the social bonding plays a factor into that as well.
I totally agree. I mean, you need a place to practice this, and um, I don't know. I've noticed different trends. In my experience, the older guys get, like, the more they tend to be able to tune in to emotions and share them with people, with friends, with partners, with therapists, just because they've been through so much and they've lived a full life. They've had a lot of pain. It's just become like more obvious to them over time. And there's also a certain like cohort of like kind of young like Gen Z men too who are just sort of almost like grew up with therapy speak in a way, like just because like psychology and therapy is has penetrated more into that generation in their family, because it's become more acceptable to go to therapy, to have anxiety, have depression, and all that stuff, that they often seem more able to like articulate emotional experiences to their.
Yes, and on a humorous level, they're also able to articulate social media-based trends in non-clinical terms like gaslighting that seem to be used by everyone and anyone. Narcissism, the whole
Yeah.
deal. Well, flipping the script here, there's also an interesting dynamic that you've observed where you might resonate with the woman's perspective because she has more of that attunement or awareness, but for obvious reasons can't share that directly with the man because he might give up entirely just as anyone would. So how do you help men understand their partner's experience while helping them become more self-aware without losing that motivation to work on the relationship?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things. I mean, one is I really pay attention to how the female partner is expressing um, these needs, right? I mean, I make a distinction early on in therapy between a complaint and a criticism, right? A complaint is, I don't like this thing that's going on. I don't like this thing about our environment. I don't like this behavior that you engaged in. Like, that's a complaint, right? A criticism is more like, there's something wrong with you, you know how dare you? What are you, an idiot? It might even be mixed with contempt. And so, I'm going to be I'm going to be training these partners in two things. I mean, one is to make sure that the woman's communication is gentle and clear and is mostly expressed in I statements, neutral descriptions of what's going on, and a clear articulation of what her need is, right? And the other part with the man is I'll often be working with him to not take it personally. And there's can be a challenge because, when couples come in, a lot of times there's been a ton of criticism. And if we're just talking about sort of the male female dynamic here for a second, because men certainly are critical, just as critical. Um, but if the female partner is just being very critical, there's something wrong with you, there's something wrong with you. I mean, that's a terrible message. And so, it can really be about helping the man to sort of come out of that and say, like, there actually isn't anything wrong with you, you just have different wishes, different needs, a different view of this situation, and it's really important for you to come out with what your experience of this situation is. And I also want to help you understand what her experience of the situation is, so that you guys can then sort of look at it from kind of a common ground. Does that make sense? Like, there's some defusing that has to go on there.
Yeah, the language I relate there to is objective subjective. When we over personalize, even though a lot of times it's just objective differences and preferences and mindsets, and so much of it is how each of you grew up in that imprint and socially, culturally, all that as well. And yet, in that moment, it's so easy for us to say, no, there is something wrong with you, or you're doing this on purpose. I know, going back to that resentment or those
Yeah.
narratives that we create, and it seems like it's having to help them each step back and detach the over identification with how someone presents is who they are versus how someone presents is just an expression and their actions that that person does, but it doesn't fully encompass who they are. And almost as if it sounds like you get them back to a baseline connection of saying, hey, at the core, you're in a relationship, and the two people that are in a relationship are connected. You've just let the layers on top disconnect you. And so now at the core, you're thinking that you're disconnected from that person. I don't know if that's on the right track.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've certainly seen, people wind up in a very like disconnected space from years of, what we call the four horsemen: criticism, contempt, stonewalling, and defensiveness, just getting in these really bad communication habits to the point where you feel like you're all alone. So, I mean, part of the therapy is couples always come in saying they have communication problems. It's like, yeah, they probably are, not so great at communication in certain ways, but it's really about getting beneath that. Okay, let's get you guys communicating better, and then we'll see like what the actual problems are. Because it's not the communication, it's the fact that you guys are essentially living in two different realities. I mean, in the Gottman world, we say there isn't one reality in a relationship, there are two. And you really have to deal with these two different worlds, and then help a couple not only to start to create kind of a consciously shared reality that they can both agree on, some of it'll come naturally, but also to rebuild the friendship. Like, why did you guys get together in the first place? You guys used to like each other. What did you guys like about each other? Do you still like that stuff? Do you still think, she's great at this or he's great at that? Couples can get very estranged in terms of just that, like, fondness and admiration. So we're trying to help them build that back too.
Yeah, that's such a good point. It's something as well that the longer you're with someone, you can get into this mundanity and over ordinariness where you forget two things. One, to go on dates every week because I got to take care of the kids or I got to finish work. And it tends to subtly start to take a back seat to where you realize, oh gosh, when's the last time we just connected to connect and enjoyed each other? And the second thing I'm picking up in what you're saying too is there's a spirit of play and adventure that a lot of couples miss, and it dissolves that at the beginning. I mean, that's the whole thing. This person's a mystery and they're new, and oh my gosh, I'm not worried about the taxes or what we're going to eat tomorrow or our plans Saturday. I'm like, oh, we could stay out till 2 a.m., and hang out and get to know each other. And that beautiful, innocent pursuit of each other, I think, is still true because two people are always changing. They're a mystery to be revealed. But sounds like your work helps them get back in touch with that spirit that brought them together. That's also, ironically, the same spirit that's going to keep them going moving forward.
Yeah, and I'm all for date nights. I think that, for a lot of couples, especially when they have kids, two careers, it's hard sometimes to find a babysitter. It's hard to carve that time out. In the Gottman world, we say small things often when it comes to these rituals of connection, right? I mean, yep, we want to have a date night as often as we can. We also want to have a what we call a State of the Union meeting, like once a week, where you just set aside some time to just process stuff that's going on in the relationship. You start with the positive things, you start with some appreciations, and then you kind of bring up some of the things that were a sticking point. And we have all kinds of like, techniques for how to have those conversations in a productive way. Every couple has conflict. We're not looking to get rid of conflict. We're just looking to make it more productive and less distressing. And then you really look at, how else can a couple connect across the week? We have all these little opportunities. There's waking up in the morning, there's going to bed at night, there's when we leave each other for the day, there's when we come back to each other at the end of the day. There are ways that we can have meaningful connections that we can rely on that help build up that fondness and intimacy. You could go for coffee on your porch every Saturday morning as one of your rituals of connection, where the kids are still in earshot. It's early enough, you don't have to get a babysitter. But what the research says is that you need 6 hours a week. I mean, that's kind of where the dividing line is between couples that are happy and couples that are not so happy, is that they have about 6 hours of couple time every week. And I know whenever I say that to couples, they're like, 6 hours? Like, where are we going to get 6 hours? I'm like, don't worry. We just start small, and we just look at all of the little things that we could start to build up that are maybe 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there, an hour for coffee, an hour of State of the Union, maybe a date night once every couple of weeks. And we can start to build it up a bit.
Yeah, that's so helpful, so approachable, so doable, and it builds momentum early to really create that positive habit. Within that space, something I'd add too, I've found that is helpful is trying to have a phone free or tech free time during that, because it's so easy for all of us, right? It's been a long day. You've just worked a full time job. If you have kids, you've put them down. Either way, you're eating and then having to clean the kitchen, and okay, now I can rest. So let's hit Netflix or let me scroll on Instagram. And while it's understandable, that trust, just to kind of set that aside and say, as much as I feel like I'm doing that, I'm just going to take 10 minutes and sit with you and see what happens. And it's interesting. I just challenged a couple with this. I said, even if you stare awkwardly, being bored is something we've forgotten to do, that is a very natural human thing, that actually some of our best moments happen in the presence of the stillness and the quiet. And I just received the email a few hours before this, and the woman emailed me, said, reporting back, we've just done the first week of sitting still and just enjoying each other's presence. And she said, the first 5 minutes, we didn't say anything. We kind of looked around awkward. She said, Wes, we ended up talking for 3 hours
Wow.
that night. And just that space that you allow, like you're saying, within the 6 hours, they're just a bunch of little gateways to connection that, of course, 3 hours is not sustainable. But to me, that's just a beautiful example of the fruits of really what you're saying.
Yeah, and I just want to echo that, like, I think technology, devices, phones, social media, I mean, I think it's putting a lot of it's sucking the life out of our relationships to some extent. I don't mean, romantic ones. I mean, friendships, work relationships, all of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. We could do a whole show on how we've internalized the unnecessary need for that. But speaking of modernity, I find, and it seems like you do as well, that many men struggle to find their place as fathers and men. They're caught somewhere between, the dad that's on the playground doing everything he can, fixing all the lunches, pick up, drop off, or reverting to that 1950s male parenting style that everyone has a problem with, which is like, hey, you're here, but not really here, more present to the cigar and whiskey or newspaper than you are the kid. So, how do you help men navigate modern masculinity or fatherhood in a way that feels authentic to them? Any tips that you would give for a guy struggling to find his role?
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, because it's almost hard to talk about because, we can talk about the inputs that men are getting from sort of either the culture or from their own personal memory of their own childhoods. And a lot of it's kind of negative right now, honestly. I mean, I don't know if you're in the same like online spaces that I'm in, but there's plenty of animus like against men for being men, which I think is just something that you kind of absorb and react to. But it's funny, like masculinity and manhood, it just doesn't come up that often for me. I mean, in couples therapy, it hardly ever comes up. And, not that often in individual therapy either. I mean, I do CBT and I treat a lot of like anxiety disorders. So I'm a little bit more in that kind of like symptom and sort of disorder space. I don't do the psychodynamic sort of exploratory work where I think it might have like more of a chance to come up. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not quite sure how to answer that one. Do you have thoughts?
Yeah, no, I appreciate you saying that. I would agree. I think I personally have even internalized those messages. I mean, even starting this podcast, having these doubts of, oh, well, what space does this deserve? Because the first and consistent comment I've heard, right, is that men have taken up the space long enough. And
Right.
while I do understand we have overstayed our welcome or over allocated in the power dynamics or representation, it doesn't mean the space goes away altogether. I mean, primarily because you're talking about a majority of the population that is going to be really hard to ignore, much less dismiss altogether. So, yeah, I think I've somewhat internalized that. And I say that to say, I think many men would agree, either that or they've ignorantly doubled down and tried to ignore the wisdom that critique or comment brings, and they try to continue the trope or the stereotype or the tradition that it continuously breaks down, because it's just not helpful. It's really not healthy at the end of the day.
Yeah.
I would say the first thing is that a lot of men feel this hesitancy to even express exploring going between those two dynamics, because in some ways they feel like society either has chosen which one they are for them, or they feel like they just have to choose instead of trying to understand what they can learn from either one, for better, for worse. And I think the second point here I'd bring up is that there's not a lot of positive male role models that holistically embody virtues that you could look to and say, I want to be like that. Coaches for after school programs that are all time low. We know that teachers in school, only 1 in 20 are male. We know that 25% of the average household now single parent, and of that 92% it's the woman in the house. So there's not a lot of men around, and as I said earlier, a lot of men are isolated and not gathering of friendships. So we don't even know how to explore some of these stereotypes, because we're not even seeing men really being lived out in the world or even online in a way that feels helpful. And hopefully that's changing. But I have just an intuitive sense a lot of men feel lost. I think a lot of men are really trying to find their way. They want to feel like they belong to something. And I think the sad reality is the most belonging and community they have is with their partner, if that. So, yeah, I agree. I think it's something to explore. And I'm wondering how this will continue to unfold given the statistics that are so disproportionately negatively affecting men, from substance abuse to incarceration to academic performance to loneliness. I just wonder at what point are some of these models going to rise up in the representation and the guidance to help guys start to explore what that may look like.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm not encouraged by what I see online, honestly. I mean, so much of what I see online is just so like it's just kind of performative masculinity. I mean, it's not just men either. I mean, I see a lot of performance coming from everyone online, whereas honestly, most of the men I meet in my daily life, are pretty nice. I mean, they're pretty nice people. I mean, I don't meet a lot of these sort of like, extreme, sort of masculine types that will kind of see sort of spouting off online. I mean, so, my hope is that, we can look for more role models in real life, and that more real life role models will appear in whatever way they can.
Yeah, I agree with that. The average guy I know as well is trying to make the most of it and try to move forward again. It just can feel like there's not a lot of traction. Who do you look to? How do you have refinement? How do you know how you're doing? My experience is that with my wife and her friends, she knows where she stands, or she might share an opinion and they'll be able to help give her feedback on emotionally where she's coming from or what the truth is in that. And I'm thankful to have healthy guy friends that do that. But I think for the most part, if you're just talking about the game and you're talking about the politics or trying to debate or joke around, it's going to be really hard to develop that self awareness. Going back to that training ground we were talking about earlier, that helps prepare us for that self awareness. Yeah, I'm not really sure. I think it's to be continued, and it's people like you and I just taking our place. And I always like to say, no more, no less. Not overstepping, but certainly stepping into. So yeah, no, I appreciate your thoughts today, and I'm curious if you have any final wisdom or tools or practices that you'd want to leave a guy with that may be helpful. Definitely the Gottman stuff. I'm a big believer in those. We'll make sure to put those exercises in the show notes. But anything else you would think has an ROI, or let's say something where a guy can start that would make a big impact to say, hey, if you just start to practice this, look into this, understand this is going to go a long way. Obviously, primarily in your relationships, which is your world.
Wow, yeah. The first thing I thought of was, lean into your male friendships and maybe take some risks there. I mean, even when it's not just talk about the ball game, still when men talk to each other about problems they're having, it can be very like solution focused. Which is helpful. And it's like one of the things that like women complain about, right? It's like I want him to like listen to me and how I'm feeling and understand me. I don't want him to come back with solutions. But that's kind of what men do, and we do it with each other too. So I would say like, see if you can find some emotion words to put to your experience, because like that kind of communication can release some of the pressure. And the irony is that whatever guy you're talking to, he's also got like painful mental experiences inside him that he would probably like to talk about too, but maybe doesn't know if he can or doesn't know how. So I would just say like just crack that door a little bit, words like anger, words like, fear, words like sad, jealousy, just whatever you can get out there and just see how they land. And I guess connected to that, the thing I would say is, we tend to say that like that men aren't as emotional, but the last 40 years of neuroscience have like, that's really nonsense. I mean, if you look at um, how reality is constructed inside the brain, and it's a fascinating subject that you could also be the subject of like multiple podcast episodes. But, one of the most, important insights to come out of the last couple of decades is that how we feel, and I don't mean like emotions so much, but like what emotions are made of, which is essentially how our body feels, whether we feel like sort of activated or not activated, and whether we feel good or bad. Like that's kind of the stuff that like our conceptual mind sort of decides what emotion we're having, right? But it's really those visceral base feelings that actually drive our experience. It drives what we think reality is. So, I guess my other encouragement would be like, if you want to see what reality is made of, like come into the body and start trying to get in touch with all of these different parts that you may not be aware of that rise up out of the body and are driving your experience and driving your behavior. I mean, one part of manhood, I would say, or adulthood, I would say, is being able to take stock of what's inside you, what it means, what it's trying to get you to do, and make the decision that you want to make, rather than be driven here and there by kind of these unseen forces in your subconscious. That's what I would say. Go deeper.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said the emotional thing. That popped in my head right when you had started sharing your first point, which is it's, I think, lunacy at this point to think women are emotional and men are not, because you're disregarding biology and all the overwhelmingly true and proven research that men are just as emotional. The conditioning is that we're not taught to be in touch with them or aware of them, reference them, express them. and prioritize them as a language in a way that we connect with others. And so
Yeah.
I think you putting it that way is also a challenge to guys to say, if you are telling me you're not emotional or you just don't get emotional or share your feelings with people, you're trying to say that you're not being human. There is a major
Yeah.
part of you that's not living that has to be expressed. So whether or not you think you can outdo again biology or reality, you might want to think again. You might want to take some time to really think, firstly, why do I hold that belief? But two, try to gently dismiss it. And to your 2 points there, give it a go and just go for it. And you're right. All of us are struggling with something. I have this analogy of like a poker table, and I don't play poker. So if you're out there and you play, just don't hold me to this analogy in its literalism. But each round you put in the chips, and every person at the table, if you're going to play, you either pass or you play, you pass or play. And trust is really that everyone's sitting in the circle. Let's say your friend group of guys, and someone puts in the chips that I'm going to take a risk. And then everyone has this choice. All right, do I jump in and do I take the risk, or do I pass and I'm just going to, make the joke or be dismissive or, avoid it? And that trust is built by saying, you put in the chip, now I'll put in the chip. And every round it goes higher and higher. And you think, oh God, the ante's getting kind of, I'm sweating here because it's starting to cost me a lot. But at the end of the day, if what I'm hearing the core message is it's worth it. It's worth the sacrifice. It's worth the investment. It's worth the risk, because what you get on the other side is belonging, connection, love, awareness, understanding, and your true humanity.
Couldn't have said it better.
Well, thank you, Dr. John Williams, PhD, for joining. It was a lovely conversation. But before we depart, where can people find your work and what you're up to?
Well, if you're on Substack, my blog there is called Cheaper Than Divorce
Okay. And you practice and are taking clients in the state of California?
in California. Yes.
All right. So if you're in California, you're out there, you need some couples help, the guy to go to. So, John, thank you again for your time. And guys, until next time.
Thanks, Wes.